Hello friends, thank you for watching this video. I am Mohamad and today we're going to be discussing how we can protect our application against unauthorized users. We're going to be seeing how we can implement API keys inside our .NET applications. We're going to be going through step by step how we can actually create a middleware where we can actually implement authentication against all of our controllers and actions at the same time. Then we're going to be seeing how we can implement filters so we can actually specify specifically which controller and which actions we want to implement authentication against. We're going to be going through step by step so we can understand how everything fits in the right place within our .NET application. If you like this video, please like, share and subscribe. It will really help the channel. As well, if you'd like to support me, please consider supporting me on Patreon or buying me a coffee. With that said, grab your cup of coffee and let's get started. So before we get started into actually coding our API key, let us understand what do we need to build and let us understand how it's going to be implemented in order for us to secure our API. So in this example here, I have a very simple implementation of a client and user. And let me make this a bit smaller. And inside this implementation here, we can see I have a client, which can be a lot of different types. It could be a web application, it could be a mobile phone, it could be any types of client that actually exist. And here I have my API. So what we need to do is whenever a client sends a request to the API will process that request and we send back the response. So it's very simple. Here we have a request going in and the API will get that request and we send the response back. But what we don't want here is we don't want anyone to be able to communicate with our API. We want a way where we can actually limit the communication between our clients and the API. And in order for us to implement this authentication mechanism, there is a lot of different ways where we can actually utilize. So we can actually utilize auth token, we can utilize API keys, we can utilize different secure connections, for example, within a VPN. So there's a lot of different ways where we can actually limit the communication with our APIs. But in order for us to make our API publicly available and to have a very little friction with our user onboarding, so that means that we don't really want to have the user to go through a lot of rigid process just for them to utilize our APIs. Again, there's a lot of different scenarios, but now we are very much simplifying this approach. What we want to do is we want to implement something like an API key. So a lot of different services use this API key in order for them to authenticate their users against their services in order for them to allow them to utilize it. And that's what we're going to be doing here today. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be basically preventing anyone from requesting anything inside our API, and basically we only allow the users to have a valid API key to actually use our services. So a request, when it's come into our API, it needs to have an API key inside the header. So we need to have an API key. And this API key, we're going to authenticate it to make sure it's a valid API key. And if it actually matches the validation, we'll process the request. If it does not match the validation, we're going to basically send an authentication error. And all of that we're going to be building today. So now that we have understood what do we need to build, let's go back to our rider. And what I want to do first, I want to install a package. And that's going to be an open API package. So I'm going to put .NET, add package, Microsoft .ASP.NET Core .Open API. Perfect. In order for me to verify that, I'm just gonna go here, right click and go to edit and then edit CS Proj, and we can see here that I have Microsoft ASP.NET Core .Open API is installed. Perfect. So now that I have that in place, the next step that I want to do is I want to add my API key configuration. And just a note here. So currently what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to add this configuration inside my app settings. But in real life scenario, it should not be there. It should be either in secrets. It should be either in, if you're using Azure, inside Key Vault, if you're using AWS, inside Secret Manager, because the last thing that you want is to have your API key available inside source control. That means that anyone who has access to your source control will be able to authenticate against your API key, and that's not a good way. What you want to do is you need to make sure that the API key is secure somewhere and no one will be able to have access to it. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to put it inside our app settings. So now what we're going to be doing here is we're going to updating the settings, and we're going to put here authentication, and this is the section that's going to be responsible for the API key, and here API key. And in order for me to generate a random API key, Rider has a nice tool here. If we go to tools, and we can see here that we have generate GUID, and I'm just going to take the first one. I'm going to paste it here, and I'm gonna remove all of these different dashes. And now basically this is my API key that I can actually utilize. So now that this is actually set and this is actually working, now the next step for me is I need to start configuring my application to actually utilize this. So what I'm gonna be doing here is inside my formula.api, I'm gonna be creating a new directory, and this directory I'm gonna call it authentication. And inside this authentication here, I'm going to be creating another class. Actually, I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call this class auth config. And this auth config is going to be pretty simple. We're going to be basically matching our API key here inside my auth config. So now inside this section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the configuration that I need. So I'm going to put public const string auth section, and this is going to be basically telling me where is the authentication section inside my app settings. And here I'm going to put, let me just directly copy it from here, authentication, and then it's going to be API key. Perfect. And the second configuration is I want to specify where the header is going to be. So the name of the header that I'm going to be reading, in order for me to make it as consistent as possible. So I have one single place where it exists rather than try to add it manually into different places. So for that, I'm going to put public const string API key header. And I'm going to say it's going to be API dash key. Pretty straightforward. So now that I have these in place, well, the next step that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to start creating my middleware. And here I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new directory, and this directory I'm going to call it, actually let's stick with the same directory. I create a new class, and here I'm going to call this API key middleware. Pretty straightforward. And we have, okay, I think it's like this. Yeah, I had a typo, so let's fix the name of this class. Oops. Okay, perfect. So now inside my middleware, what I want to do is I want to actually utilize the pipeline, middleware pipeline, in order for me to inject the request and actually read it. And if you're not aware of the middleware, I have a different video where I can go through the different process of explaining how middleware works inside ASP.NET. But basically, a middleware is basically, we can think about as a service which run in order whenever an application, a request is coming in. And this order will actually allow us to access to the actual request, which is gonna come in through the client. So whenever a client does a request, before it actually hits the controller, it will go through these middlewares in order for us to do some kind of a validation, authentication, etc., etc. And in this scenario here, we're going to be basically pulling that request, checking if it is authorized or not to continue. If it's not authorized, we're going to be stopping that request and sending not authorized. If it is authorized, we're going to be allowing it to actually continue to process. So this is going to be the main focus. So within a middleware, we are actually able to intercept the call before it actually reach our controller. And this is the middleware that we're going to be building. So here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to put private read only request delegate, and we're going to put next. And this is basically the request delegate. It is like the pipeline, which is going to be allowing us to understand the requests coming from the previous service to our service, and then we're going to be passing it on to the other pipelines. If we pass the authentication, sorry, if it does not pass, we'll stop it there. And then we're going to put private read only I configuration, and that will allow us to read the app setting configuration. And we're going to put configuration here, and then we're gonna initialize them to the constructor. So we can just right click here, and yeah, we can click on this one, initialize through constructor. Again, similar one here, initialize through constructor. Perfect. So now that I have done this, I can put this in a single line. Yeah. So now that we have initialized this, now we need to actually build the body of our middleware. And to do that, we need to put public async task, and we're going to put invoke async. And here we're going to take the HTTP context, and it's going to be context. And then once we have done that, now what we want to do is we want to utilize this context that we have here in order for us to read the header which is coming in and authenticate it against what we have. So now what we want to do is inside our context, we're going to put var provided key, actually provided API key equal context dot request dot headers. And here what we want to do is we want to actually access the auth config, and I'm gonna go to my API key header and I'm gonna put dot first or default. So this will actually allow me to get my provided API key, and then I'm gonna check if I'm gonna check right now if this API key that has been provided is valid or not. So I'm gonna create a function which is gonna be responsible for this validation. So I'm gonna put var is valid equal is valid API key. I'm gonna create this function now, and I'm gonna pass the provided API key. So now I'm gonna take this, and after here I'm just gonna put public, actually let's make it private, bool is valid API key is gonna ask for a string provided API key. And first of all, what we want to do is we want to check if this is empty or not. So we're going to put if string dot is null or empty and provided API key. If it is, I'm going to return false. If it's not, I'm going to get the valid API key from my app settings. So put var valid API key equal configuration dot get value. And here I'm gonna paste my path, which is gonna be the one that I have specified inside my auth config, which is gonna be the auth section. So I'm gonna put here auth config dot auth section, and basically here I'm gonna get my API key. And once I get my API key, I'm just gonna put return string dot equals. And here I'm gonna basically match the valid API key with the provided key, and I'm gonna put string comparison to ordinal, and that should be it. And basically now the first thing that I'm checking if it's null or not. If it's not null, I'm basically getting the actual key that currently exists inside my app setting. Is if it is a valid API key, I'm basically, once I get it, I'm gonna do a matching between the valid API key and the provided one, and basically if it is valid I return true, else I return false. So now that I have done this, the next step is I want to check it. So put if is valid. So first of all we're going to say if it's wrong, so I'm going to put here await, we're going to generate a response, and I'm going to pass the context, and I'm gonna pass the error that I wanna pass, so 401, and I'm gonna pass an invalid API key. So that has actually invalid authentication. So let us build this function, generate response, which should be pretty straightforward. Let's hide this, we don't need it. And here, all I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put public, actually private, static, async, task, generate response is going to take the HTTP context, perfect, it's going to take int the HTTP status code, and it's going to take a message. And then here all I'm going to do is put context dot response dot status code equal to the HTTP status code that I got, and then I'm going to put await context dot response dot write async, and I'm gonna pass the message that I got. Okay, perfect. So now that I have this in place and I was able to generate an invalid response, let us see what else gonna happen. So once I do that, I'm gonna put return, and then if everything goes to plan and the user is allowed to actually execute this authentication, all I'm gonna do is just continue or give back this request to the pipeline so it will be able to reach my controller. And to do that, I'm gonna put await underscore next, and I'm gonna pass the context. Just a quick refresher here. So basically the middleware works something like this. So for example, let's say this is our .NET pipelines, and this is the first, it's gonna run into this direction. So from the request comes in all the way to the controllers. So basically here inside of this, I'm gonna have, for example, my first middleware, then it's gonna go to the second middleware, then it's gonna go to the third middleware, then it's gonna go to the fourth middleware. So it's like basically it's embedded all within each other, and it's gonna go all through all of these different middlewares. So let's say these middlewares. So it's gonna go through all of these. We can think about them as like a pyramid. So we'll go from one to another and from to another until, for example, here we hit our controllers. So currently, let's say this one here, I'm gonna make it in green. So let's say this one is our authentication. So in case for any reason our authentication failed, we will not allow this request to progress any further to go up to this one to the controller. We'll basically stop it and return it. So let us use the right arrow. Let me just find the right arrow here. I can just use this one and adjust it. So what happening here is, yeah, let's make it just like this. So the first thing is the request coming in is gonna go to the first middleware. Then once we have it in here, what we're getting is, then it's gonna go to the second middleware, and then once it gets to the second middleware, it reaches our middleware, which is the authentication. In case it passes, we let it pass to the other middlewares so it does further work before it reaches the controller. In case it doesn't pass, what we wanna do is we wanna revert this. So basically, it's something like this. This is a bit awkward to, let us just make it here. Can I flip this? Let's see. Yeah. Let's make this a bit smaller. Okay. So in case it fails, I will not allow it to continue. I just propagate it back through the same structure of the middleware. Through the same structure, so it will go back without actually hitting. I think you get the point here, but that's the point. So here, for example, the request comes in. So this is 1, 2, 3. Here 3, if it actually passes, we'll continue, but right now it does not pass. For example, it just go back 4. So this is 5, sorry, and this is 6. But in case it passes, what's gonna happen is gonna continue forward. So 4 will be here. So if the authentication is matching, so this will be 4, 5. Let's remove this, and then it reached the controller. 6, and then vice versa, it will exit through the same thing. So this is really important here, because this here is playing an authentication role to see if we actually allow the request to go in or to stop that request from processing. And this is where API key is really works well with the middleware, because we don't really want to bombard our controllers to execute stuff without actually being authenticated. And this is going to lead me to the next point that we're going to be doing here, is how we can actually utilize the middleware currently that we have created. If I go back to Rider, in order for me to utilize this middleware, all we need to do here, I'm just going to copy the name of my middleware, and I'm going to go back to my program.cs. And the way that I'm going to utilize the middleware is I want to actually inject it to my application. And as you can see here, I have my application has been built, and then I'm using the HTTPS redirection, I'm using the authorization. So what I want to do is, before I use my authorization, I want to actually authenticate. And order here is really important, and I cannot say this enough. Make sure that you add it in the right place. So here we're going to put app.use middleware, and here I'm going to specify the middleware that I'm going to use. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop this from execution. I'm going to comment it out because I want to run my application, see it working without a middleware, then enable it, and then see it working with the middleware. So now that it's building, we can see it's running. I'm going to go to my Insomnia. So now inside my Insomnia here, I have a simple call to my API drivers, and if I click on send, we can see here I was able to get the response back. If I get a specific driver, so let me take this ID, I go get a specific driver, I update this here. Let me clear the responses and click on send. We can see I got it. So now that means it's working. So now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go back here. I'm gonna stop my application. I'm gonna enable the middleware that I have, which is the authentication one. and I'm gonna run it again, and now we can see it's running. I'm gonna go back to Insomnia, I'm gonna execute the same request, and now you can see I got a 401 unauthorized. And again, if I go to all drivers, I click again, we can see I got a 401 unauthorized. So let's see how we can make this authorized. So I'm gonna go here to headers, I'm gonna specify API key. So I'm gonna type API-key. I'm gonna go back to my app setting to copy the API key that I have added. And I'm gonna put it here, and let's try it out now. So I'm gonna click on send, and we can see I got a 200 and I was able to get the response. So in order for us to actually verify it's actually working as it should be, I'm just gonna add a breaking point here so we can intercept the request. So again, I'm gonna go to a specific driver which does not have an API key here inside my header, which is should give us a 401 unauthorized. So here, for example, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the API key from the header. And here, for example, we can see it's null because I did not provide it. And I'm gonna add another breaking point here. We can see that it's null, and it's gonna basically go into return false. And since it returned false, we're gonna generate invalid authentication, and basically we're gonna have a 401. But if I update it, I'm gonna put here API-key, and I'm gonna provide it like this. I'm gonna click on send. Now we can see here that I got my API key. It passed the validation. So first of all, it's not null, which is perfect. And then here I have this is the valid API key, and now I'm gonna be doing the matching. And let's see what we got. If it's valid, yes, it is valid. So I'm gonna let it continue to the rest of the middlewares. Perfect. So now this is working, and we know. So let's try it now. If we put an invalid API key, I'm just gonna add AAAAAA and see if that will also work. So send. Let us just remove these breaking points now. We don't really need them. Yeah, and I'm gonna click on continue. We can see we got an unauthorized. If I remove it and I click on send, it works. Let me add another like this. Invalid. If I remove it, it works. Perfect. So now what I have done here is I have actually implemented authentication across all of my different controllers. So now every single controller inside, or basically every single request coming to my API, is gonna be forced to have authentication. But what happens if I only want to have authentication against certain controllers? I don't want it to be available across all. There's only certain controllers that I want to implement this authentication on. And this is what we're gonna be implementing now, where I can actually limit the controllers where I can have the authentication against. So let's see how that will work. So I'm gonna go back to Rider, and inside Rider, inside this authentication directory, I'm gonna add a new class, and this class is gonna be called API key authentication filter. Perfect. Yes, I'm gonna add it, and what I wanna do here is I wanna actually inherit. Actually, I wanna utilize an interface which is called the async authorization filter. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm gonna utilize an interface called authorization filter, and this authorization filter will allow me to actually add a filter to every single action inside my controller, or to my full controller that if I want to, in order for me to implement authentication, rather than having a middleware inside my program.ch which is going to be running across all. So let me implement this. It's complaining because it did not implement the missing members. So now that I have it here, let us see how we can implement it. So first things first is I want to inject the configuration. So I'm gonna put private read only configuration underscore configuration, and then I'm gonna inject it through the constructor. Perfect. So now that it's actually injected through the constructor, let me just put this, let me stop this and make this like this so we have a bit more space. And now what I want to do is I'm just gonna copy these two validations that I have from here. So the API key, I'm just gonna copy it so I don't have to rewrite it. I'm gonna add it here because we're gonna be basically doing the same thing here. And once I have this, I'm gonna start implementing the on-authorization async. And the first thing that I wanna do is I wanna remove this here, and I wanna get the provided key. So I'm gonna put var provided key equal underscore configuration. Actually, it's gonna be context dot http context dot requests dot header, and then here I can put the same thing as I done before, which is going to be my auth config dot API key header dot first or default. So if we take a look at here, basically here what I did is I took the context, which is already the HTTP context, in order for me to access the headers, while here I utilize the context, which is the authorization filter context, because this is gonna be the one which is attached to the controller or action. So it's a step further down. So if I go back here to draw.io, so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture the context from here after it has been added a lot of different stuff to it, rather than trying to capture it here where it's still only a HTTP context. So I hope this makes sense when I'm trying to understand the different layers of middlewares and how they actually stack on top one of the others. So now that I was able to capture this one through the authorization filter context, which is going to be attached to the controller or action. Inside of it is going to be the context, etc., etc. Once I have done that, now what I want to do is I want to actually utilize the valid action. So as we did here, I basically took all of this, and let's also take the generate response, because we did not take it before. So let me take the generate response. Let me add it here. We're going to update it, but just to avoid some typing and retyping, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it here. So first of all, here we have provided API key. So let's just change the name so it will match. So this is going to be the provided API key. And the first thing also I want to do here, I want to make this async. So it's going to be functional. And here, rather than having the generate responses, let me just remove this and utilize something which is built into .NET. And this is going to be the following. I'm going to put context dot result, and I'm going to say equal to new unauthorized result, actually unauthorized object result. And here I can pass the message that I want, and I can say here invalid authentication. And once that's done, I'm going to do a return, and that should be it. So I don't need this, so I'm just going to remove this. It's just to keep stuff simple. So here what we're doing is basically we're taking the API key which is available in the header, and then we're doing it similar to what we did before, to the normal validation that we have, if it's null or empty, and if it actually matches the one that currently exists inside our app settings. And once we have done that, is basically we're checking if it's valid or not, the response. But here is the difference. So in the previous example, what we have done is we needed to intercept the request from moving forward. We needed to start returning directly back to the user before it reached the controller. But in here in the filter, because it has already reached the controller, well, just before the controller, what we need to do here is we don't want it to, we cannot use that same logic to pass it to different middlewares and so return it up the, we don't want to directly intercept it from here and stop the request. What we want to do is we want to utilize the result, because we can think about it as a result from the action inside our controller, and return back the response. So here, if we hover over the result, we can see it's an iAction result, and this exactly iAction result is what we have inside any of our actions inside the controller that we return. And this is the key item here. Is this iAction result is we are returning something as an action will have returned. But in the middleware, basically we stop the processing of the request. We create a new response from our side, which is going to be directly writing into the context and then returning it. So that's going to be the main differences. So now that we have actually, because we are using it as a filter, we can actually tap into the iAction result. And as we did here, we have the iAction result. We were able to add an unauthorized object result, and we are returning it. So once we have done all of that, what I want to do is I want to go back to my program.cs. I'm just going to comment this out, so I don't require any authentication across all of all. I'm going to have specific authentication. But what I need to do is I need to inject this iAuthentication service inside my DI container, so it will be able to be verified. So I'm gonna put to be able to be loaded. So I'm gonna go back to my program.cs. I'm gonna put builder.services.add scope because basically we want it to load per request, and then I'm gonna add it here, and that should be it. So now that I have API authentication filter, now I can actually inject it and use it against my controller. So again, I'm gonna use it against my driver's controller. Now because I have removed my middleware, if I go back here, I'm gonna run my application. I'm gonna go back to Insomnia. I'm gonna delete this API key. Actually, I'm gonna put a random API key, AAAA. I'm gonna send it. We can see I still get a response. If I delete it completely, send, we got a response, because basically what I'm doing here, I don't have any types of authentication anymore. I have a service which does authentication, but I have not attached the service to any of my controllers or action. So now let's see how I can attach this to any of my controllers. So I'm gonna stop this. I'm gonna go to driver's controller, and now the first thing that I want to do is I want to attach this here, and I'm gonna first of all make it across all of the controllers. I'm gonna put it on a specific action. So to do this, all I'm gonna put here is service filter, and this is, if you remember, we called it API authentication filter, so we can see here the correlation. And then I'm gonna put type of, and then I'm gonna specify the API key authentication filter, and that's it. So now if I run this, we can see it's running. If I go back to Insomnia, if I click on send, I got a 401 because I'm calling the driver's controller and I do not have that API key attached to my request. And now if I click send again, similar, but if I go to all drivers, I still have the API key available. I click on send, I get the response back. Now if I copy this and I go to get a specific driver, I add this header API-key and I put it here, click on send, we get the response back because now it's actually working. So now that I have done this, the next step is I want to put it on a specific action, and the way I do it, I just basically remove it from the top of the controller. I'm gonna put it on the get driver by ID only. So now I click on execute. We can see it is running now, and now we got specific driver. I'm gonna remove this. We can see I got a 401. If I go on to all drivers and I remove this, we can see I'm gonna able to get the response now because I don't have that in place. If I go here, I got a 401, so let us implement it here. I'm gonna put API-key. Let me get the key again from my app settings because I didn't memorize it. And then I'm gonna put it here, click on send, and you can see here I was able to make it work. And that's gonna be the main key thing. Either I can actually implement it across all of the different services that I have, or controllers and actions, or I can make it specific to specific controllers or action. Now, once we have covered all of this, the last step is what I want to do is, now that we were able to use this because we utilized directly through Insomnia and I were actually able to attach header. But if I go right now, let me keep this on running. Let me open my web browser. Now, if I open my web browser and I go through Swagger, as you can see here, there is no way, if I get, for example, get specific driver, try it out, put the driver ID, let's copy it from Insomnia. So this is the driver ID. Execute, I'm gonna get a 401. There is no way here I can actually attach my API key. So let's see how we can actually update Swagger in order for us to take advantage of API keys there. So I'm gonna go back to Rider. I'm gonna stop this and I'm gonna go to my program.cs and update it from there. So what I need to do is I need to utilize this endpoint here, builder.services.add Swagger, and I'm just gonna add some configuration to this in order for me to actually able to utilize it. So first things first is I wanna basically make it in order for me to have much more capabilities, to add more functionalities here. So I'm gonna put x.add security definition, and I'm gonna call this API key, and then here I'm gonna put new Open API security scheme, and this is why we have installed the Open API package at the beginning. And then once we have done that, I'm just gonna specify the scheme's information. So I'm gonna specify the description. I'm gonna put API key to secure the API, and then I'm gonna specify the type. and the type is gonna be security scheme type. I'm gonna put .api key. We have different ones. Currently we're using API key. Then I'm gonna specify the name, and I'm gonna put the name for it, which is gonna be auth config.api key header, and this is what we need to look for. And then I'm gonna put the in, and I'm gonna say where does it exist. I'm gonna say it's gonna exist inside my header, so parameter location, it's gonna be header. And lastly, I'm gonna put the scheme, which is gonna be API key scheme. Perfect. So now that I have done that, now I need to specify the scheme. So var scheme equal new open API security scheme. And now I'm gonna specify the reference for it. I'm gonna say equal new open API reference. And here basically I need to specify the type, and the type is gonna be reference type dot security scheme. And then lastly, I need to specify the ID, which is gonna be API key. And once I have done that, now I need to link it all together. I'm gonna say, oops, n equal parameter dot header. And now that I have my scheme available and I have it here, so all we need to do is just link these two together. I'm gonna put now var requirement equal the new open API security requirement. And here we can specify the scheme that I want. So scheme and a list, new list of string, and then let's remove this. And lastly, we're gonna put x.add security requirement, and I'm gonna put the requirement here. So basically what we have done here first is we had added the definition, and this is basically gonna be the section that we're gonna be seeing on top of our Swagger. And then here I'm telling it what type of scheme that it needs to utilize for authentication, and this authentication scheme, I'm telling it that's going to be an API, and it's going to be in the header available, so it needs to inject it in the header. And then I'm specifying the security requirement, so the requirement is going to be the scheme here. And basically if we take a look at that, it always take an open security scheme and the list of value. I don't have any list of value that I want to provide by default, so that's why I left it with an empty list of strings. And lastly, what I did here is I took those security requirement for my for Swagger, which is basically here Swagger generation options, and I added the security requirement with this, so it will be able to actually directly work. So now if I run my application, and as we can see it's running, if I go back to my web browser and if I refresh, we should be able to see that I have a new button called authorized, and this is what we have created here. This is my authorization. If I click on it, we can see here that I have the definition that I provided, the name and the header and the value. So now I'm gonna go back to Rider. I'm gonna copy this API key. I'm gonna put it here and authorized. We can see now it changed it to log out because now it has a value. So now if I go to get driver by ID, let me get the driver ID. I can get it directly through Insomnia. And here I'm just gonna copy this driver ID and I'm gonna add it to Swagger. So try it out, execute, and now we were able to get it. If I remove this, if I log out, and now I try it again, we got a 401. If I log in, it will work. So basically what we have done here is we were able to actually implement API keys through my services. So I was able to directly implement it through all of the different controllers that I have and actions through a middleware. Then I was actually able to add it as a filter, to add it to a specific controllers or action. And then I updated my Swagger in order for me to be able to take advantage of this. I hope this video was helpful. Please put any of the questions that you might have inside the comments and I'll be able to address them. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any ideas that you would like me to cover, please also put them in the comments down below. I hope this video was helpful. If you'd like it, please like, share and subscribe. If you'd like to support me, please consider supporting me on Patreon or buying me a coffee. Thank you very much for watching and have a great day.